So here we are on a Facebook Live. Is this your first one, Dave?
It is, Ruth. Thank you. And great to see you. Yes, absolutely. Very much looking forward to the conversation today.
Me too. So everyone who is listening to this, just welcome to a conversation between two new friends. We met a couple of weeks ago, and if we introduce ourselves, and then we're going to carry on exploring the conversations around human trafficking and how to prevent and stop it from sharing of both our worlds. So I'm Ruth Durnley. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Stop the Traffic. And Stop the Traffic is a global organisation, been around 15 years, and we are committed to do what we say on the tin. But our key focus has been around the use of technology and the power of people in order to prevent trafficking.
Thanks for that, Ruth, and it's clearly an amazing organisation. And my name's Dave Miles. I'm Head of Safety for Facebook for Europe, Middle East and Africa.
So our first question that we were asked to talk about was that everyone has a role to play in the fight against human trafficking. And why is this of particular interest to Facebook?
Yeah, great question. And I think, thank you. Thank you very much to Stop the Traffic for inviting me to speak today. Stop the Traffic has been part of a long-standing partnership we've had to fight human exploitation on our platform and our broader responsibilities in terms of tackling harmful content. And it's quite timely too, given that on November the 25th, it's the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And Facebook is engaging in its annual 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So this is just so timely. And that runs into the Human Rights Day on December 10th. And it's in support of the UN Secretary General's call for global action to increase awareness and really galvanize advocacy efforts in areas like women's safety and trafficking. So we're so pleased to be here today. I think the first thing to say really is that with more than 3 billion users on Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook, Facebook's mission clearly is to build communities, bring the world closer together. And we believe that in order for people to build healthy communities, they have to be safe. But I would also add at a personal level that tackling human exploitation has been a thread throughout my career. Prior to joining Facebook, I was a member of the expert roster of UNICEF's Global Fund to End Violence Against Children, who funded projects specifically in the global south around child sexual exploitation and abuse. And I well remember the signing much earlier of the Palermo Protocol in 2000 and watched with interest the work of Janice Wolak and Dana Boyd and other academics as they tackled the emergence of technology at that point as a factor in human exploitation. Recently here at Facebook, we've had a particular focus on sex trafficking as a subset of human exploitation. And in 2019, for example, in consultation with more than 20 organizations, we reviewed our policy, made some changes, and brought together both the human trafficking and human smuggling aspects of our policy into one coherent strategy. And Stop the Traffic was part of that. It was a really interesting exercise. And it just is a great example of how, from a partnership point of view, we need our partners really to get that kind of expert guidance.
David, you sort of mentioned a number of actors as you've gone through that, and the question of everyone has a role to play.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, everyone has a role to play.
Yeah.
And I think if you're watching this, and I hope by the end of it, it's the power of technology through this that actually gives us all the potential in a very powerful way to have a role to play. Trafficking is a system. So from sort of my learning over the years is that trafficking is a very complex crime, but it is actually about one fundamental thing, and that is making money. It's a global business that has incredible power and profit, and that business engages and uses every aspect of our society to thrive. So I think my challenge in the early days of could we stop the traffic? could we live up to our brand and name? The only way we were ever going to do that is if we were truly able to engage every actor. So that is governments and businesses and finance and banking and NGOs and communities and faith groups and enforcement. I mean, it really is every actor. Everyone has a role. And I think I'm getting to the stage where I believe if we don't have every actor, we can't do it. And yet this is so important and of interest in our partnership of how Stop the Traffic and Facebook have worked over the years. Because the very root of how we do this is all about communication. If you're going to grow a business, however illegal, you need to communicate. You need, in order to entrap and snare, coerce, and to exploit, you need to go to market. You need to recruit. And then you need to be able to move money, and you need to grow your business. And you do that to make sure that the money goes to the right places. And then you need to be able to increase demand. Make sure that demand satisfies and service the supply chain. So, you know, to answer the question, does everyone have a role? If everyone doesn't, we're not going to succeed. So, for me, from the UN, that we both share admiration for, to actually a 9-year-old with a mobile in their hand on Facebook. Everyone has the power to communicate, and everyone has stories to tell. I think that's key. I mean, as we explore, it takes us to that point of the role of technology, because you, David, said in your sort of extraordinary career of all the work that you've done, I mean, you said people began to think about it, but would you almost say people are only really starting to grasp the power and the necessity of technology in recent years?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think your observations are spot on. I do think that it is a global effort and it involves so many actors. I think too, unfortunately and sadly too, because so much of trafficking and these harms seem to be almost have an endemic quality about them. You need a long-term plan. So, you know, whilst I think, you know, you can try and eradicate these things, humanity is a complex individual. And I think the reality is that it takes time to do that. So, I mean, first and foremost, Facebook is a technology company. So our work with Stop the Traffic is really key. I think what I learned too through much of the work I've done previously is that a child abused at a very young age is often, it's a catalyst to actually a lifetime of exploitation and vulnerability. And so, and for me, that emerged very strongly, particularly on the work that I was doing in terms of allocating funds to specific projects, when we knew that abuse led to prostitution and to other things. So seeing harms in single silos is not a healthy scenario when things like poverty and hunger and things like that are often the drivers behind these kind of things. I think that the good news on the technology side is that there has been a significant shift in policy emphasis towards the vulnerable in general, much more, certainly in the last 4 to 5 years. And I think the big change there is that if you go back 10, 12 years, children and the vulnerable were a very marginal element of those people that were online, because you had to have a relatively large amount of money to own the technology. You had to have access to the internet, particularly in the global south, that just wasn't there. And in the last 5 years, that's changed dramatically. And the problem that poses as a consequence is that high-speed access and phones which are capable of streaming abuse and being used in the trafficking of individuals are becoming more and more sophisticated, and the crime behind that exploits that advantage. Now, more than a third of the world's users are children. So that's a completely different dynamic. So the increased regulation you're seeing, which which we welcome in terms of trying to get a frame around the harms and to tackle with government some of these issues. Really, really important. Has really come into sharp focus in the last 4 or 5 years because of that youth demographic. And today's young people are tomorrow's adults. So if they're exploited, very good chance they could be exploited going forward. I think the other thing too, as well, is that there is some incredible work. If I think of the work that we do with NCMEC, which is the clearinghouse for sexual exploitation and abuse images, that is becoming a very sophisticated model. The ability to report through our platform, and to give you an idea of the scale of that, if you take Q3 2019, we actually took over 8 million pieces of child sexual exploitation and abuse content down in 1 quarter. And that 99% of that was before anybody could even view that. So the technology is really starting to develop, is starting to come into play. And if you couple that with expert human moderation in more than 50 languages, you're also able to start to develop a global response. Because if you go back 10 years, the internet was predominantly an English-speaking sort of, liberal democracy, and that's just changed dramatically. So it is truly global. And I'm conscious of when you very kindly shared the traffic analysis hub that you did recently, which I know you guys are doing a lot of work on. And that spoke to me both about the global scale of the challenge, but the ability to act locally in specific situations, in specific cultures. And I think that's hugely exciting. It's why Stop the Traffic and other organizations are so important to us, because as a technology company, we can only do so much, and that's a lot. But we need the guidance from people like Stop the Traffic to make sure that it's proportional and that it's effective as well. I hope that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so many, it's such good answers, good questions, that raises lots of questions, doesn't it? Because what we know is we're trying to work together against a very sophisticated, organized business, criminal one. and technology, when it is created, and I'm not talking about just digital platforms, but if you go back to creation of the invention of a car, or we often find that criminality, or the way to exploit people, is often faster at moving than those of us seeking to prevent crime. And we're often feeling like we're catching up, because this is also new. We're always entering new phases. Technology is forever driving ahead. I think from my point of view, my dream is that we get ahead, that we can predict something before it happens in order to prevent the harm. And that's we're looking to try to get to. And that is a big, bold dream, but I think it's possible. I think we're in an era at the moment where we're trying to do that as a world against a virus we can't see. And it's teaching us a very important lesson, that we know technology and the use of technology and scientific invention is critical to our future, but it also needs communities to work together. Communities who know things, communities who share, communities who can watch out for each other, communities who genuinely are concerned about their neighbours, not just of themselves. So for me, Stop the Traffic and stopping the traffic, which is, I know, our sort of shared passion, exploitation around this, using any means, is always about how can we globally capture a picture to understand how this business model is working. This criminal business model is just, you give a great example of an element of it around NCMEC. There's these glimpses of how it's showing itself, but if we could try and granulate that picture globally, but we have to be able to activate locally. So we've got both, because you and I have worked in enough different sectors to know that you can't and shouldn't force a community just through some edict, but information is power, information and the ability to communicate. And again, I come back, everyone has the power to be able to receive information and share it with this in their hand, and the power of being part of a community like their Facebook group. You know, they're empowered to be able to know something that therefore they can share to keep them safe. So I think technology has offered us the most extraordinary potential future.
Yeah,
just amazing. We're just grappling with it, aren't we? We're grappling to try and utilize it the best we can, because we're learning. We're all learning in this.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 points there. I think firstly, the very phone that you were showing there actually provides the kind of evidence that law enforcement needs often to prosecute. You know, one of the things that struck me in tackling child exploitation was that you can prosecute on the basis of an awful lot of evidence if it's online, and that's huge. And for law enforcement, that's important. As NCMEC passes that out to law enforcement agencies around the world, that's really powerful stuff. And to remember too that there are such huge offline dimensions to a lot of these harms as well. So they're often indicative. So I'm thinking of your trafficking analysis hub. You know, that's a collection of data. In other words, data can be very powerful. I think the other thing too is what we're seeing very rapidly in the last few years is the emergence through things like the Tech Coalition, Project Protect, through the ReProtect Global Alliance and others, is an acknowledgement from platforms that actually cross-industry collaboration can be hugely powerful too.
Yeah.
And so Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp are just some of a huge ecosystem of platforms. And so how can we work with other leading platforms to do that, and often platforms that are in regions which are probably not in the countries that we're in? How do we establish best practice? How do we create a framework around this and a common approach? And so there's some really fantastic stuff in that area, and I think Facebook has done a lot of work recently in that to try and sort of bring those entities together. And I think you'll see a lot of announcements over the next year or two, particularly from the Technology Coalition and Project Protect, where players will come together. They've signed a voluntary principles around child sexual exploitation and abuse. And, you know, I can see similar things happening in lots of other areas too, as we tackle this sort of really difficult problem.
Do you know, I have to say, the most powerful statements, but also this creation of active collaboration is actually the answer for me. Someone said to me the other day, what would you say is the revolution that's needed in order to stop trafficking? And it's sharing. It's such a simple word, and everyone likes to use it, and not very many of us do it very well. And we have all sorts of reasons for that, but what technology has given us the power to do is to share at scale. So you can keep, you're not forced to keep something to yourself or just those who you physically know. But if it's something that's good, if it brings safety, if it's a piece of information that actually can enable others to make better choices, you can share it across the world. And I suppose that you've mentioned Traffic Analysis Hub. It's come out of a deep belief that we need to share not just within NGOs or not-for-profits or enforcement, but as we said before, to bring a new space together where banks, businesses, and digital and tech and government and enforcement and civil society, and importantly, communities where actually most of the most pertinent, rich information is actually held.
Yeah.
Actually, it needs to come together, and we need to be brave enough to find ways to do that, because the only danger then becomes, I would say, the danger is that we raise the risk for the criminal business to operate with the necessary level of risk it needs, rather than at the moment it's just too low.
Yeah, no, great points, really great points.
Look, we've said technology, and I should just say here, Facebook have been actually, we couldn't have innovated our recruitment campaigns, the campaigns that we do in a geolocated way. When we've got intelligence, we call it our intelligence-led approach. We gather stories, we get and collect from partners, we build trusted relationships, then we analyze that data. And with another tech partner, IBM, who have been part of our learning and journey to date, remarkable. And then we want to communicate that message in a way that those who are at risk within those communities can be empowered. And Facebook is the most remarkable partner to have, because it enables that to happen, and for us to do it in a way that is safe and focused, and for us to be creative at it. Again, we're back to that point. This is all about communication. Do you know what's true about someone telling you about a job that just seems too good to be true? You know, there it is. We're down to the belief, is this true? And the amazing thing that we've begun to see and measure in the last few years is through these campaigns that have now reached over 7 million people with Facebook into vulnerable communities, is we've been able to measure the change that's happened in a community because of the information that we've shared, that people have actually shown, I wouldn't have done that if I'd have known what you've shared, or I didn't do it because of what you shared. And that is prevention. So that inspires us. It inspires me to think change is possible. You know, we don't have to wait for crises and harm to come. We can actually see a future where communities are being built and empowered that learn and have the strength to say stop, not here, not in our community. And I think that use of technology is exciting.
Well, that's great to hear, Ruth, and I'm glad we can be at least part of that solution, should we say.
What about the general public? David, I was going to ask, in terms of the role that you're in now, and you've referred already backwards to the amazing experience that you've had, have you seen a change in the level of engagement with the general public in sort of the type of work that we're talking about, you know, around stopping exploitation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the key thing to say is, I think there's a couple of things that the public need to really, I think the first thing is the public need to be vigilant, and that's an ongoing education exercise in terms of trafficking. Trafficking can manifest itself, as you know, in so many subtle ways. And I think reporting trafficking content on Facebook is something we really value. Having said that, it is an area that often suffers from a lot of underreporting, because often people that are in those situations are very reluctant to report. They don't trust establishment. So there are some dynamics around that make reporting quite difficult. But when we encounter it, we act very, very quickly. We would always recommend that the public first, follow up on their hunches, report it through us, go to Stop the Traffic and have a look at the great resources you've got. Sometimes fact check the information you see as well. That's true. That's really, really important, depending on what country you're in. I think the other thing is, when we get reports, our users can report images, videos, posts, comments, pages, groups, messages, both on Facebook and Instagram. And when you've got over 3 billion users globally, that's a lot of intelligence potentially in terms of lots of different harms, including trafficking. And when reported, that content is reviewed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in over 50 languages. So that's got to be an opportunity, I think. And I think it's those elements that I would say. It's about staying vigilant, and it's also about having an empathy for those that are vulnerable around. If you can start there, it's not always a trafficking issue. It can be a mental health issue. It can be other issues. I deal with a spectrum of harms from day to day, from suicide and self-harm through to bullying, and thankfully the very, very small portion of what we deal with overall, most people feel very empowered by technology and by being connected with each other. and often can be very supportive of each other in those situations as well. But that ability to report, or to have the confidence to report, I think is something that needs to be worked on, I think, in general.
Mm. No, do you know, human beings are just amazing. You know, we are just incredible creatures, and you know, I have never in all my 15 years come across anyone when they've asked me what I do and I say, oh, you know, it's one of those conversation stoppers. I prevent human work for an organization looking to prevent human trafficking. Nobody has ever said, oh, why are you doing that? You know, that's all right, isn't it? Of course, because fundamentally in our being, our DNA is people shouldn't be bought and sold. I think translating that into how we behave, into the context we live in, making it safe for us to share stories. If we see something that doesn't feel right, probably not. You know, that we have the capacity to not just translate what's going in through our eyes, but our whole senses can translate within our brains and souls something that says something's not right. And then I think we're making it possible, again, as you've said, within Facebook, Stop the Traffic with our Stop app. You know, there's multiple numbers or helplines to ring, but just again, making it within your hands there, within what you hold and is mobile in your hand, the ability to do something with what you've seen by keeping you safe. Because not all of us have the gift or the opportunity to walk in and share that with somebody. Many of us do, but some also, I think, we don't want to waste people's time. We don't want to do something that we think might be wrong. My learning in this is by sharing something, particularly if you can do it anonymously or report it on a platform, technology again gives us the gift to be able to share that into a trusted space, not putting anyone else at risk, including ourselves. But actually, we do want to do good. And we don't want to walk away with a piece of information that leaves us thinking, I wonder if I should have. And there need be no regret, because once you've placed it in there, the great gift of big data, taking a little bit of a story and putting it with a mass of other little bits of stories, actually can begin to be the place where we start to see trends and patterns. We can identify hotspots. That's what technology gives us that we didn't have before. And I think the exciting part of that is every little story shared is valuable, everything. And you can't get it wrong, you know, because that's partly how data pictures and technology can begin to push outliers to, you know, that people can act on something that begins to come forward as a very clear threat. And as you said, all those that have reported to the site that things can be done about that. You know, I always say you can't stop what you can't see. And our greatest challenge is, for all of us, we're trying to see more. We're trying to get sight of this. So anything that you see, if it doesn't feel right, then find a way of sharing that. And as I say, download the app, contact the Facebook platform, phone a helpline wherever you live. Who do you trust to share that piece of information that it goes forward? So they say general public, don't they? I think there's nothing general about the public. I'm a member of the public. I think it's actually the fantastic uniqueness of human beings that we do actually care. And if we see something, we want something to do, but we need to make sure that that's safe. And again, technology gives us that gift that I don't think we had a while ago. Let's go from the wonderful public to the governments. So in terms of government, David, important role in tackling trafficking?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's very key. And as we discussed briefly earlier on, our technology coalition and those sort of cross-industry partnerships extend to government, and clearly that's very important. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because if you look at, for example, the EMEA region, which is hugely geopolitically and diverse culturally, I can't think of probably a region that is more diverse in that regard. We have to work with local governments to understand what's going on the ground. Countries are in different stages of development very often. So, for example, in Africa, we have very significant problems around women's safety. They have a huge and burgeoning youth demographic that's emerging very rapidly there. And so basic issues like digital literacy and those kind of issues are having to be addressed. And those perhaps in a European or a US context were addressed more than 10 years ago in terms of doing that kind of development. So we have to be really sensitive to where the country is in its development cycle, what resources they have available. Not all law enforcement is endowed with great resources. There are often, countries that suffer, quite dramatic political change. I mean, in Africa this year, there will be more than, and there'll be some of these will be postponed, but there are more than 20 countries having elections this year. So it's just an indication of the fact that different regions are in different stages, and those things are really important. And harms and risks emerge from that kind of area, and technology has its role in trying to make sure that people have an opportunity for freedom of expression to participate in the political process in a free and active way as much as possible. But again, our partners are really key on the ground. So it isn't just governments, but also we value partners that are independent of governments as well, and are advocacy on the ground, really frontline mission work, and governments can often direct us towards that. So we have more than 400 safety partners globally. That's the sort of scale of it, really, in terms of structure. And that's running from child safety and women's safety through to issues in the LGBTQI community, through to the vulnerable, and that includes those with special needs or learning difficulties. So we have to think about all of those things, and we have programs and policies in those areas to try and support those young people and give them a voice, as well as other members of the community. So government's really important. Good regulation is important. The ability to make sure that legislation is passed in a timely way, and that's the other issue too. The digital age is moving very rapidly, so it can very often take many years to put good legislation in place, which allows us to tackle some of these harms, but we work very closely with governments to try and make that possible. And also to work with governments in a way that acknowledges that these harms evolve. So, you talked about the money and the crime, these people are opportunistic, their business models evolve, and so governments and industries' response has to evolve as well. And I think the final element too, as well, is one about transparency and measuring impact. So we have a community standards enforcement report that we publish on a regular basis. The last one was, I think, in May, which is us trying to be transparent about the data we collect in the reports we get, the harms we see. And that's going to be a really important role for not just for us, but other leading platforms to be as transparent as possible about how we're tackling these issues, how we are measuring impact, not just in trafficking, but harms in general, so that people can just feel safer in a world that can often be very uncertain and as we know from COVID, unpredictable at times.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? We talk, I couldn't agree more. We talk about governments, and absolutely, they have a role. They have such an influence. And yet we also recognize that, like everything, they can't do it on their own, as can't not-for-profits. And nor can business. And tech companies and technology, everything on its own is going to fail. But I think it's been really encouraging to see governments engage in this. And obviously, you can't tell that. I mean, from my accent, I'm British, actually. So you bet, I'm pleased that the UK government and led with a Modern Slavery Act in 2015. You have to start somewhere. It's how you learn. I loved what you said about, look, legislation is never perfect. You're learning, and so you put something out there. We were Stop the Trafficking very much involved in actually just the bit about supply chain transparency. That was the piece that was very systemic and preventative from our part, and our learning around the campaigning and businesses and the business model approach that we were taking. And then to see that starting to replicate and migrate and impact in different legislations and jurisdictions. That's how we learn, whatever sector we are. I read last week the USA action plan on trafficking. I have to say, I think there's some fantastic steps forward in that thinking to bring in the aspects of financial, and I keep talking about money, but we have to look and see this as a crime around money, collaboration, the research, looking at prevention as maybe number one, because what we're trying to do here is stop harm. And I think some of the most powerful, obviously, people I've listened to, the powerful stories of those who have journeyed this, their stories are the currency that we need to honour and embrace, and allow those stories to amplify, which again is what data and technology can do. It's actually only by embracing those stories and giving them the volume they need, not because we want to do anything in any way to expose those people, but actually technology allows us to take stories and give them that worth and power at no risk to anyone. You know, to bring that and collate it into a data picture is not about removing humanity. It's actually giving it its fullest potential. And I think then you start to enable all of us, governments included, to understand and see what is it that's going on. And I couldn't agree with you more when you said governments. Look, the responsibility for every government, I mean, I for one wouldn't want to be a prime minister. You know, it's a tough job. A politician is a tough job. And they're looking at lots of harms. For me, the window of when someone can be trafficked, it starts from a vulnerable space where, you know, they can be caught and a choice is made and you're on a journey. And we know by our work with those who are homeless, those who have suffered abuse in any form, it's all that journey of exploitation where you can get drawn deeper and deeper, and then to a point where trafficking can occur. And prevention is all about narrowing that window till it's closed, till protection and you're safe. And actually, that's the way I think if for governments who are trying to look at all these potential harms, there is a holistic view that we can do using a data-led, intelligence-led approach of how can we work together across these potential harms to close that window of exploitation. Because I think if we do that, governments, business, sectors, financial, digital, charity, enforcement, all of us in our networks of passion and the things we hold can close that window shut.
Yeah. And Ruth, I think that's an amazing call to action, and thank you for the questions today. I think this conversation is testimony to the fact that we could not do what we do without you in this specific area, and that's fantastic. But also, it strikes me that you're very hopeful about that as well. And I think that's testimony to Stop the Trafficking and your leadership too, because I think that's key too. You know, these harms sometimes are very difficult to deal with. I know our content moderation teams work on harms day in, day out, and it is about believing that we can have a significant impact on these kind of things that go on. So great to hear, and thank you very much for your questions today and for remaining such a great partner for us.
David, thanks for coming along for the conversation. I hope there's more of them. I hope the more we can share conversations and the more people we can include and stimulate conversations of hope and change, then I think, and thanks for your partnership for Facebook. We wouldn't be able to be learning what we're learning without you. And I think as long as we keep learning and realizing the potential for change, we can give due voice to everyone who wants to be part. And I hope if you're listening to this, the very first question is now a statement. Everyone has a role to play in fighting trafficking. So do join in. Thanks, everyone.